Hello and welcome to Lead Tail TV. My name is Brian Kramer, keynote speaker, coach of coaches, and author of There's No B2B or B2C, it's H2H, Human to Human. Today I'm going to interview Garrett Ruiz, Head of Content Strategy for Adobe Digital Cloud. We're going to be talking about today how his team, Garrett's team, is measured at Adobe. We're also going to be talking about what is the common thread for working throughout Silicon Valley at all the different technology companies that he's worked at, and what is the thread for marketing. The last thing is, as a court researcher, he's reviewed 20,000 different eviction notices and eviction statements. So how did that kind of project or that kind of timeline and process help him become a better marketer? Okay, so let's get to it. Here's Garrett Ruiz.
Garrett, how are you doing? And welcome to the Lead Tail TV interview here.
I'm great. Thanks, Brian, for having me. And I know my title's a mouthful there, so thanks for wading through that. But I'm excited to chat today.
You're head of commercial content strategy for Adobe Experience Cloud. You're right. That is a good one. How are you? What does that mean?
Yeah. So. As you may know, Adobe has quite a few products in its portfolio, and the business is basically broken up into three clouds, we call them. There's the Creative Cloud, which is Photoshop and those products you're familiar with. There's Document Cloud, which includes things like PDF and Adobe Sign. And then there's the Adobe Experience Cloud, which is really focused on technology for marketing professionals. And there's both a business segment that's focused more on enterprise businesses and a more newly formed division focused on the commercial segment. So that includes a couple companies that Adobe acquired over the last couple of years, Marketo and Magento being those primary two. And so I'm responsible for content strategy and creation across those business units, really focus on the commercial segment of the market is my audience that I'm thinking about.
Wow, so not a small role, and,
No.
and a lot of change. How are you measured around that kind of job? It seems like it's gigantic.
Yeah, and it's kind of definitely something I'm starting to get my head around. You know, is a new opportunity for me to have a couple different products in my purview. So probably the two primary ways that me and my team are being measured is sort of one, can we efficiently build a content engine that meets the demand of a very hungry demand gen team? So I have a lot of counterparts that are focused on inbound and outbound campaigns, and they need content to fuel those initiatives. So one area is just setting up that engine to give them the ammo they need to run those campaigns and meet their goals. And then kind of beyond that is the efficacy of the content that I'm feeding them. And really, is that resulting in not just leads, but converting into pipeline for the business?
How is that to work with what seems to be like Adobe might, to the outside world anyway, alongside bigger companies like that, to be an octopus where you've got so many different arms and lots of different things. And when you say content, it can mean so many different things. Give us an example, if you don't mind, of what that might look like.
Yeah, that's a really good question because it can take so many forms, and there's so many different like tentacles, as you said, sort of reaching out into the market. But for what my team is focused on, that can be anything from blog content to video, ebooks, guides, podcasts, webinars, and all of that is really with the goal of helping to create awareness and, like I said, sort of create pipeline for right now. It's the Marketo and Magento businesses, so our marketing automation solution and e-commerce solution within that commercial segment. So that the content is all those things that are getting pushed out on our website via social and in campaigns that my demand generation counterparts are running.
How would you measure that process? I know it's lead gen, but there's so much testing going on to see what eventually works. Just because it's released doesn't mean that it's and not working doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It still, there's so many different avenues for sharing a blog post that where it doesn't work in one place, it might work in another. And I'm super simplifying it, obviously,
Hmm.
but how do you measure the idiosyncrasies of a piece of content?
Yeah, well, I have the benefit of having access to some great tools that are just inherent in the Adobe portfolio, and the Marketo platform actually has some pretty advanced sort of analytics and measurement around what channels is content performing in, who is it reaching, what segmentation do we need to look at. But yeah, like you said, there's a lot of different channels, and what works on one may not work on another. So this I have a little bit of the sort of personal mantra around just the amount of data that marketers are inundated with, and some of it great and some of it not so good. But I do have the benefit of tools and also teams that help me sort of look at where is it performing, where do we need to make adjustments. And as a content marketer, I really kind of rely on those counterparts to come back and tell me, hey, this is working in these campaigns, because I just simply can't have that depth of insight into all the programs that they're running. So that's a feedback loop that we try to keep open so we can pivot and make adjustments as needed.
Mm. What are you looking for specifically on something that works versus something that might create a pivot?
Yeah, well, I am embedded within our demand generation group, which means that there is a pretty heavy focus on net new lead creation, and as well as cross sell and upsell. So how are we reaching existing customers and sort of introducing them to other elements of the portfolio, or additional products that maybe benefit them. So it does come back to pipeline generation and revenue a lot. I, as a content person, like to look at some other things outside of that to get an understanding of what's resonating, where are we creating some brand awareness to help complement some of that lead generation efforts. But kind of because of where I sit in the business, you gotta try feed the engine to continue the growth of the company.
Oh, that's great. Is there do you have a favorite KPI that you look at that, just kind of lights you up?
um, Well, in all honesty, I am not a data guy. So the true answer is I don't love looking at numbers, but it is an important sort of part of the world that marketers live in now. So when I can see that not only has content helped sort of add names to the database, so to speak, but that those have progressed through the funnel. Those are things I love to see. I love to see when content helps kind of move someone from an early stage to a later stage, so that those kind of pipeline acceleration KPIs are always really encouraging, because you're saying, okay, it got people in, and it's sort of helping carry them through the journey of where we want them to go.
Oh, that's great. What kind of content do you see works better for moving people through a journey versus some stuff that may just you would think it'd work, but it just doesn't?
Yeah, we've been doing a little bit of experimentation with customer stories, and I think for a long time the traditional case study was thought of something that was a little bit further downstream. It wasn't at the awareness or sort of research phase. It was more when a prospective buyer had decided, yeah, I'm probably going to go with these guys, or I'm evaluating them against a couple others. Let me see some proof points. We've been trying to introduce those a little bit earlier in the journey, because I think there's can be some great storytelling that happens for a customer that can be engaging to bring someone into that journey a little earlier. So that's been something exciting that we're kind of playing with, to see how do we get those stories out a little earlier, and not just sort of confine them to getting that prospect over the line and making a decision.
Have you noticed types of content having a difference in terms of like video versus written versus in-person webinars? I mean, I could keep going, but have
Yep.
you seen anything there?
Yeah. I think I think it kind of depends on the stage. I think all the things you mentioned sort of have their place, but video is something that sort of continues to be interesting, and particularly moving into more kind of short form video content. Um, but the other area that there's been a lot said about this is sort of that interactive bucket, and that can take a couple different forms. And I can't say that I have sort of a ton of data on that at this point, but we're starting to play around with it and kind of see what we can learn and sort of mix up that mix of mediums that we have in the arsenal today.
So I want to ask you a quick question here before we move into a couple more behind the scenes of who is Garrett. So I'm just pre-warning you there. When you, what would you say to someone who just started a job like yours and they're head of, commercial content strategy or content strategy of any kind, and they're just starting and beginning, and you look back on what you've done and say, man, if I had known what I know now, I would have done what differently? What would you tell them?
Yeah. So I think this is going to come back to the point where we had a little earlier, just about the sheer amount of data that marketers have. And I actually have a little bit of like a bone to pick with this sort of data-driven marketer concept, because I think that marketing should always be a mix of creativity and looking at the data. But what this volume of data does, I think, is can sometimes enable a little bit of, I'll call it laziness, because it's very easy to stay safe and say, well, what worked last year is just what we'll do again. But any new idea, any new innovation didn't have historical data behind it, but it's easy to get sort of stuck in that cycle. And I think there's a lot of pressure on marketers now to say, show me the data, show me the data. And we get asked for it sometimes very early in the life of a campaign. And then you start to sort of put forth some vanity metrics because you're like, okay, I gotta show them some data points, but I don't have much to show. So I think what I would say is sort of stand up and say, let's balance what we do in terms of how we use data to inform what we do going forward. Let's step outside of that. Let's take some risks, and it always helps when you have an environment where that's encouraged to have some fast failures and that kind of thing. But there were certainly times in the past where I think I just sort of stuck to the straight and narrow because there was some easy data points to point to, even if it wasn't particularly innovative.
That's awesome. I hear you and feel you on the vanity metrics versus actual metrics, and pointing in the right direction, creating things that matter. And man, do I empathize with you on that data, on that point. I'd love to just take a tiny bit of a shift into prior to when you joined Adobe.
Mm-hmm.
You actually went from you've been with a company that has the letter A, but your previous three companies start with the letter B.
Yeah.
Blue Jeans, Blue Snap, and Bloom Energy.
Yes.
This a lot of B's in there.
Yeah, I used to have a line in my LinkedIn profile that said, I will consider companies that don't start with B. It wasn't intentional. It's just kind of how it landed. So now I'm going kind of back to the beginning of the alphabet, and maybe I'll just try to run through and see if by the time I retire I can hit them all or something.
That's awesome. So what are you seeing in terms of the differences of the kinds of companies that you worked with in specifically around content,
Mm-hmm.
and your role as it's evolved? How have you seen that change?
Yeah, well, the great thing about working at a couple different places that had some different business models was I got to try out some different flavors of content marketing. So, for example, when I was at Bloom Energy, that was a company that was focused on large scale electricity production. And so those contract sizes were in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. So really we were marketing to the person who can sign a check for that large, which is usually the CEO of the, kind of Fortune 1000. So that taught me how to get really personal, how to sort of create a persona of one sometimes or two within a target account. And a fun story I'll share there is we were trying to get a deal across the line with a large oil company in Europe. And so the CEO was based there, and we were kind of trying to figure out how we could get his attention. And so we actually decided to build a scale model of our product and ship it to him and set it on his desk so he could sort of see how these energy systems work. But I think that was just a fun example of how to get really creative in your marketing when you understand your audience. So that was great. But the hard thing about that was my focus was so narrow that I wanted to get some experience in sort of some other sort of marketing disciplines, and some of those doors were definitely opened up when I moved to Blue Jeans, the service we're using today, and talking to a wider audience. And it's a SaaS-based platform, and so there's kind of another type of marketing and lead nurturing that comes into play there. And we had multiple personas we needed to create content for. So that was kind of an excellent years of learning experience for me to take into what I'm doing at Adobe now.
If you had to say that there's one running theme throughout all of that, what would it be?
I think it was that there's an emotional element behind every lead and every deal, and I know you talk a lot about the human to human element, and that really resonates with me because especially when you're doing marketing at scale and you have big lead numbers to hit, it's easy to lose sight of that. But it's something that I try to come back to, and I like to think that I've been fairly successful in sort of bringing that emotional or human element into the content we create. And sometimes it's very dry topics, and that's tough. But I try to always come back to that and think about would a human on the other end want to consume what I'm putting out there.
And it's kind of interesting with the whole personalization piece. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you've had any experience with that on how to personalize something so it does come across a little bit more human. Like you said, there's the story side, which touches my heart. How does that connect with the person on the other end? But then there's the, personalization, or sometimes even over personalization, like going too far. I'm sure you've seen that. How do you see that happening now and maybe in the future?
Yeah, it's certainly can be a double-edged sword. I was reading a story the other day. I won't name the brand, but they had a goof where they sent out an email to a bunch of people that said, "Congrats on your newly arrived baby," and none of these people had a baby recently. And so those are like the gotchas that come with personalization. But I do think it opens up some great doors to be a little bit closer to that audience. I think the hard thing for people like me and content producers are how do you sort of do that personalization at scale? It can become very overwhelming to say, hey, here's the 10 industries with 3 sub personas, and we want to get really personalized content for them. And all of a sudden you're like, I don't have the cycles to create content at that scale. So you got to prioritize it. You got to find sort of things that can double dip sometimes. But I do think it can be really valuable. And if the business is okay with saying, hey, we're going to sort of deprioritize some things in an effort to get more personalized, then, more power to those content marketers who sort of have that air cover to just focus on some of those audiences that they really care about.
It's interesting because you were talking about the energy business that you were in and how you were focused sometimes on just one or two people. And personalization is, can oftentimes be actually looking at those archetypes of one or two or three or four people. And now you're at a business where potentially maybe I make up in my head that it might be reversed. It might be, more people than you can deal with, and yet the person who's really signing is still just one person.
Mm-hmm.
And so, well, maybe a handful in some cases, but a lot of what we're talking about too is that account-based marketing, and I think you were doing it long before it was actually called account-based marketing.
Yeah, that
Is
wasn't a
that
term back then.
no, no? And so, are you seeing that as a reliable opportunity at a company this size, or is that too wide, too much of a bigger net than what you might go after?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's always going to be a mix of both, sort of that ABM effort and call it more traditional lead generation. I think that will be the case going forward. But what we try to do is sort of rope off a segment where we want to do that double click down and say, okay, we're going to invest a little bit more here to be more targeted, more customized, and also try to sort of line that up with how our counterparts in sales are approaching an account. I think that was maybe historically a bit of a miss because I think for a while sales has been doing account-based targeting in a way that marketing wasn't always. And so we're trying to get smart about, okay, this has a handoff at one point, so let's line up those ABM efforts. But I think it's always going to be a mix of both. But we are certainly delving into that world.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a shift again into the world of Garrett and
Okay.
talk about the fact that for 5 years you were a court researcher, which is so much different than what we've been talking about. You reviewed 20,000 eviction cases in Santa Clara County. Tell me about that, and were there any parallels or learnings that informed your own marketing career or the content machines that you've been building?
Yes, definitely. And, in some ways, that is sort of what caused me to be a marketer, but not for the reasons you may think. I was actually on a pre-law track, planning to go to law school and become an attorney, and that's why I was doing that work and discovered that was actually not the right vocation for me. And so it sort of forced me to look around and figure out, hey, what else is out there that I want to do? And I kind of stumbled into marketing, but it was the best thing that happened to me. But I think, something that I took away from that experience is, I was looking at eviction cases here in Santa Clara County and reading through caseloads. And there is often a really sometimes heart-wrenching or poignant story behind some of these cases. And so I think what I was able to take away is much like we were talking about, there's a human behind every lead. There was a human behind every one of these eviction cases. And it created some empathy for me that I like to think has served me well. Be kind, think about others. And that's helped me to, I think, build successful teams and have good relationships and have a great career so far.
Oh man, well said, and the human part is what I'm seeing as the red thread coming through with everything that you do. It's definitely loud and clear that that's what's most important, and I couldn't commend you more for bringing that to the table and everything that you do. I also on the human side saw that you on your Twitter profile that you're an outdoor adventure and travel enthusiast.
Yeah.
Tell me about your most memorable travel experience or one of the experiences that you've had.
Oh man, yeah. My wife and I have had just amazing opportunities to do some traveling. And I actually met my wife abroad in Switzerland. So you may think I'm making this story up, but I met my wife rappelling down a waterfall in the Swiss Alps. And the rest was history, as they speak. But that kind of created a foundation in our marriage where we just really both have a love for traveling. So I'd say in recent years, one of the most memorable experiences. I'm a huge soccer fan, and a big bucket list item for me had been to attend a World Cup. So we actually went to Russia last summer and attended a handful of games and went to a bunch of different cities. And the energy and experience at a World Cup just puts any other sporting event you've been to shame. I can't even quite put it into words. So that was just this intersection of two loves, travel and the game of soccer coming together. So that was really, really fantastic, something that I'll treasure forever.
Um, well, holy wow. I didn't really see that coming, that you met your wife rappelling down
Yeah.
a waterfall. That's incredible. Um, that just about takes the cake. And ironically, my wife and I's second date, if you can call it that, was at the Women's World Cup that was here in
Oh,
the United States in Los Angeles, and we saw Brandy Chastain at the
oh,
very end when
amazing.
she won. And I couldn't agree with you more. The energy level and the enthusiasm, and oh my God, and we're she more than I are both soccer players, and so that was really
Oh,
cool,
yeah.
and I could see why. So well, Garrett, I wanted to kind of end on a personal note of something fun and exciting, and I think you just did that. So I really appreciate your time. And with that said, all good things must come to an end.